Hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on the impact of the election in the United States on foreign policy world affairs. The fact is that this election was very important. It carried the legacy of an administration, the Biden administration, with Vice President Harris, Kamala Harris, who very late in the game decided the Democratic Party, the leadership within the Democratic Party, and many very influential people decided that she would be the nominee. And the question was, once that decision was made, the legacy of the administration, the record of the administration, of the Biden-Harris administration, domestic and foreign policy record would be carried by that candidate, whether it were Biden or Kamala Harris, as it was in fact Kamala Harris. That record is something from which no one could run away from. And it is that record and that legacy of the Biden-Harris team that cost the Democratic Party the election. The record is, I look at the loss of the Democratic Party's bid for the presidency, not just as a result of a single factor. I want to bring up an excellent study by the Pew Research Center, very prestigious research center. The Pew Research Center, and people can go online and find the report on this beautiful report, excellent report, indicated obviously that roughly 2/3 of the American people were concerned about the economy. However, there were outstanding issues with regard to foreign policy, and it was no secret that the American people were weary of the war in Ukraine, which is a proxy war led by the United States and its allies in NATO, and costing American taxpayers hundreds of billions, by the way, because it's not just the aid sent to Ukraine. It is also the impact of money from social development programs, economic development programs to support military adventures, with a very serious question that many people, well-thinking people, were asking: where is this headed, considering that Russia has more nuclear warheads on this planet than any other country, including the United States, by the way. So the question is, what was the end game of all this? Where was all this headed? And that is something that cost the election, because there is cost the Democrats the election, because there is a connection between foreign affairs and domestic affairs. And many analysts, well-thinking analysts, were asking the more serious question, which is, why is this government, the Biden-Harris team, with the neoconservative elements running the foreign policy establishment doing this? Why is it going on with this? And then, okay, to add another dimension to this, the Gaza genocide takes place. There was almost universal condemnation, with the exception of the United States and very few countries globally. Very few countries did not agree that this was not genocide, including, by the way, elements within the United States, including elements within the State Department, people who resigned in protest, calling it for what it is, based on international law, based on the Geneva Convention of 1949. Okay? So you have people within the government, within the Biden government, resigning in protest within the State Department, in protest, because the US lost the moral authority. It tried to maintain it as much as it could when the war in Ukraine was unfolding, but it lost it once it began defending a genocidal war in Israel. Now, did this cost the election? Not by itself. I don't want to overstate the importance of that, of foreign policy in any case. I want, however, to underscore, make sure people understand that there is an inexorable relationship between foreign policy and domestic affairs, and that the direction that the US was going, not only did it lose the moral authority, but it was going toward the right-wing direction, because that government, in the Zionist government in Israel, the Netanyahu government, is a far right-wing government by the admission of US officials, not just even the liberal press, as much as it tried to cover up for it, by the way. Okay? So if you have an administration, and by the way, Kamala Harris was the vice president, which is embracing what has happened in Israel over a year now, a year and a month, why would people, especially progressive Democrats, as Bernie Sanders pointed out, leading the progressive Democrat wing, why would they vote for the Cold War Democrats, which Kamala Harris, the vice president of the United States, represented? Why would they vote for her? Now, there has been some analysis by mainstream Democrats, the so-called Cold War Democrats, arguing that the fault lies with those misguided voters of the Trump camp, going back to the Hillary Clinton thesis, the deplorables, right? Going back to that thesis, that the fault rests with the voters. How dare they not vote for identity politics, Cold War, militarism, apologists of genocide and a proxy war in Ukraine, going nowhere, going absolutely nowhere. It's a stalemate at best, and it's not a stalemate that the West is going to win, by the way. Not the way it's going, because China and India and the global South are predominantly behind Russia. The BRICS summit in Kazan that Vladimir Putin hosted illustrated as much. The West was shocked. We tried to isolate Vladimir Putin, and yet he hosts a BRICS summit in Kazan, and lo and behold, the global South and China are there and India are there embracing Vladimir Putin. And all that effort, all this time, a failure, and yet no retreat to embrace a rational course of diplomacy and diplomatic solution, a political solution, exactly as a number of countries from Brazil to China to Turkey, Turkey, by the way, a NATO member, have advised, not to mention, of course, a number of European countries, no retreat from the abyss, no retreat from a war of attrition going nowhere. Now that Trump has won, the question is, as the title of this session illustrates, indicates, will the United States follow a status quo position in foreign affairs, or will the United States pursue a route toward isolationism as Trump did during his first term? There have been some publications of the list of names that Trump has, I guess, surrounding him, advising him on foreign affairs, and Mike Pompeo, of course, is one of those. And we'll talk more about that. But I do want to further uh, elaborate on the role, because I have done a session on foreign affairs, how the Middle East influenced the election process. I do want to focus more, a little bit more on that, and then I'll move on. The fact is that the United States, people will recall, began under Biden-Harris leadership, began to adopt some very harsh policies to silence pro-ceasefire critics. All of a sudden, as though we were back in the McCarthy period of the early 1950s, all of a sudden, being in favor of peace was an anathema to the United States government, to a democratic government. The Constitution itself, the First Amendment of the Constitution, was subordinated to supposedly a national security interest, to the degree that the US Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, but Democrats leading the way, the US Congress went so far as to equate Zionism, to equate anti-Semitism with Zionism. If you're anti-Zionist, that means you're anti-Semitic, which is absurd in itself, because there are many Jews all over the world, including in the United States. Many, by the way, who have protested, gone to jail, lost their jobs, university professors losing their jobs, being accused of anti-Semitism, when in fact their only crime was that they were pro-peace and and anti-Zionist. Okay, so you can see how foreign policy indirectly, although people in the Pew Research Center public opinion poll, they, the way the way polls are conducted, they're very clear-cut questions. Do you believe Israel is going to influence your vote? They go, no, it's my job and job security and my income and so forth. So, however, there are issues here that are interrelated, that public opinion polls don't reflect, but people in the real lives have accepted as a part of a whole. So the foreign policy of the United States is not separated from domestic affairs. When US government is not willing to consider addressing economic development and social development, but has no problem allocating billions in foreign aid, military aid, whether it's Ukraine or Israel, at a time that the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations rapporteurs, one after another, and governments all over the world, the vast majority of them, have clearly said what is going on over in Gaza is genocide. And then in October, of course, we had the expansion of that war into Lebanon, with Israel fully approved by the United States hitting Syria, Iraq, Iran, obviously the ultimate goal being Iran, itching for a full out, all out Middle East war with Iran as the target so it can somehow cover up the genocide over in Gaza, as though that would do it, as though there is no record in the age when everything is live, because there are live images transmitted of children dying, IDF bombing hospitals and saying, well, I'm just beneath that hospital there are Hamas people and they're hiding arms, which they may very well be. I don't know, it has to be verified, but let's say it is. That justifies killing all the sick people in the hospital, the people being treated, and the doctors, the medical staff. That's it. That's what we've come to. A violation of the Geneva Convention and a war crime, by the way, just for the record. That is a war crime. And the US going along with it. All of this alienated the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Without the progressive wing, they can't win. They cannot win elections. That progressive wing is essential. Kamala Harris did not embrace until the very last day, right before the election. She came out and said, if I win, I'll stop the war in Gaza. I'll do something to stop the war in Gaza, in Israel. Last day. Yet, she would not allow a Palestinian American to speak at the convention. Okay? Now, what's ahead for the United States under Trump? Let me point out that the United States is indeed a status quo country. However, global power shifts with China leading BRICS and having developed a very deep and wide strategic alliance with Russia and an economic alliance with India, recently settling the border dispute with India, very important, settling some outstanding issues with Vietnam, very important, making sure that the only focus remains on economic development for itself, obviously first and foremost for China, and technological development narrowly focused on especially semiconductors and artificial intelligence. Okay. And China continuing to make progress in economic development and economic integration through the Belt and Road Initiative program. That's now 10 years old. Okay. That is a reality, and in itself, considering that China's GDP in purchasing power parity is at least 7 trillion higher than US, measured by the same metrics, okay, the same criterion. So that will be at the top of the agenda of the new administration, although the Biden administration has made Russia and the Middle East the focal points. Not that it hasn't, by the way, continued the Trump policy toward China. It has. There is remarkable continuity of US foreign policy between Trump 2016 to 20 and Biden 2017 to 21 and Biden since he got elected. Remarkable continuity in foreign affairs, with the exception of getting involved in Ukraine and then giving carte blanche to the Netanyahu regime to go to these extremes that the world is stunned that it would do. It would go to these extremes. And at the expense, by the way, at the expense of the rest of the world, because these wars have economic and social development consequences globally. The Europeans, there are many Europeans highly skeptical that they got this deep with the United States leading it into that war of attrition in Ukraine and that embarrassment in Israel. Trump has a 4-year record. That 4-year record, it was marked by a hyper aggressive stance toward China, amelioration of relations toward Russia, amelioration of relations toward North Korea. That went nowhere, of course. Aggressive stance toward Iran, pulling out of the nuclear agreement, the multilateral nuclear agreement. Amelioration of relations and improvement, trying to get the Arab countries to basically come together to some form of rapprochement with Israel, especially the Saudis, always looking for foreign policy to be more of a commoditized. In other words, foreign policy under Trump is more of a neoliberal commodity, trying to use it to sell more weapons, especially to the Saudis who can afford them, obviously. And there were deals, people may recall, during the Trump presidency with the Saudis. And in return, the Saudis would, in fact, embrace Israel and extend trade. And by the way, in case people have any illusions, while that has soured, that relationship has soured, the fact is that the Arab countries have remained close trade partners with Israel all through the genocide. Rhetoric aside, and there's a lot of rhetoric on the part of the Arabs, arguing, yes, we're against what Israel is doing, it's genocide, and all the rest, from Jordan to the Saudis and so forth to Egypt, all along cooperating commercially with them in trade, all along, okay, selling out, so to speak. In other words, not doing anything to support intangible terms like cut off trade with Israel, with the exception, in fact, of Yemen and Iran, and with the exception of groups within Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, obviously Hamas in Gaza, all those pro-Iranian, and pro-Iranian groups in Syria and Iraq, with the exception of those. The rest of the Arab world normal trade relations. Okay, that's the reality. The United States was all along well aware of that. The United States worked hard to make sure that they didn't back off of that. What will happen with Trump? There will be continuity in of U.S. policy toward Israel. U.S. policy toward Israel has remarkable continuity from Truman to Biden, and it will continue to be pro-Israel under Trump. How he will manage the relationship and how Trump will try, because he's pledged he will end the wars, by the way, both in Ukraine and that's what he said in his acceptance speech. We'll wait and see. But he has pledged that he will end the wars. How he will manage the Israeli Palestinian question, how he will manage Saudi as well as the rest of the Arab relations with Israel, how he will manage the Iranian relationship remains to be seen. My guess is, considering Pompeo is one of the key people, but there are others also as anti Iranian, fanatically anti Iranian as Pompeo and Trump. I think that the focus once again will revert to demonizing Iran. The Iranians are prepared for that. They're concerned. They're prepared for that. There will be an amelioration with Russia. I suspect, I agree with analysts that Trump will ameliorate relations with Russia. I think he will ameliorate relations with Russia because he's just not as ideologically blind. He's more pragmatic as a businessman coming out of a business background. He just doesn't see what the end game is here. And my God, who can blame him? Because there is no end game. It's unwinnable, by the way. A military solution in favor of the West in Ukraine is just out of the question. Um, Maybe if they use nuclear weapons, which means nuclear holocaust, by the way, for all sides concerned, maybe it's winnable then. But there are no winners. We have to go back to the 1960s nuclear doctrine called MAD, mutual assured destruction. That's not an option. Mutual assured destruction is not an option. Death for everybody, or the old Cold War slogan among American Cold Warriors, better dead than red, during the old Soviet period. That's not an option. Um, there have to be rational minds that prevail. I suspect not that Trump is not going to bring in some fanatics, because he has them already. But I suspect that he will serve above all the interests of Wall Street, because he has had the considerable backing of Wall Street. In 2016, that's how he won. In 2020, that's what has happened. People know they can go online and look at the money that has been spent for on both sides. The GOP, we're talking billions, by the way. When you combine these billions of dollars that Wall Street has invested, I call that an investment, to make sure that these, no matter who won, they don't deviate, serving the interests of Wall Street and the military industrial complex. However, Trump, who pursues cult of personality politics, he puts out there himself as part of the policy. Okay. More than any president I have in my lifetime. I think that he will ameliorate relations with Putin. He has that fixation. Part of it because he doesn't see what there is in it for him, for the United States, not for him personally. I don't want to get into personal stuff. What there is in it for the United States to be pursuing this road. He will try to get the best deal possible. Um, this is going to be probably a top priority, and that I agree with a number of policy analysts. Once that is gets going and is settled, that will define what he does with Europe, what he does with the Middle East, what he does with Iran, what he does with Israel. So once because it'll be very difficult for Trump to settle that issue, which needs to be settled, by the way, because it hasn't been going anywhere anyway. It's just mass destruction. Um, toward what goal? Once that issue is settled, and Putin is going to try to see if he can settle it. By the way, the Kremlin, people who have been watching the news know this, has not come out and and he hasn't been enthusiastic and euphoric about the Trump victory. It's very reserved. It is basically stating the Kremlin policy, official policy is right now, is we are going to continue with what we've been doing. We are going to wait and see what Trump does when he comes to office. He's not in office. Biden is still in office. So they're taking a wait and see attitude. China is taking a wait and see attitude. They're not jumping the gun on Trump. Of course, the Chinese are a bit more proactive, and they congratulated Trump and everything. And they are trying to see if Trump will be a little bit more restrained with regard to sanctions and tariffs. We'll talk more about that. But the U.S. Russia relationship will define the broader U.S. relationship with Europe and the Middle East. So let's look at that, what we can expect from that. Trump has stated again and again that he expects NATO to carry its own weight, NATO members, sorry, to carry their own weight. You know about the 3% limit. That is, the United States expects members to spend 3% of GDP. Very few countries spend that. However, there have been some reports out of Paris that Macron and Scholz, basically Germany and France and Germany, have recently discussed that now that Trump is the incoming president, the reality of Europe carrying more of a burden, and perhaps if the point that has been made in the articles that I've read on this issue is, if France and Germany are going to carry greater burden as NATO members, then they're going to have a greater voice. They're not going to play or roll over and play dead. They're not going to acquiesce to everything, not going to agree to everything the U.S. says. If they pay more, they're going to have a greater voice. So there is a correlation between the money they spend and policy input they're going to have. This is going to be a pretext on the part of the Europeans if they want an out, or at least more and more ease out of the blind commitment they had during the Biden period toward the U.S. with regard to everything the U.S. dictated on Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I think Trump actually presents an opportunity for the Europeans, a pretext, a very cheap pretext at that, in my estimation, to ease out of that. Trump has made wild statements about not caring that much about NATO. This is all part of the unilateral predisposition that he has, by the way. Unilateralism, by the way, I want to make sure that I define this in case people have any reservations. Unilateralism does not mean that the US is disengaged. Unilateralism simply means, go the origin of this go back to the three Republican presidents of the 1920s. They were unilateralists. It just means the US wants to go at it alone. It doesn't want foreign entanglements. Basically, it doesn't want to be dictated to by anybody. Not the Europeans, not any international organization like the UN. And Trump is in that vein of the Republican spirit going back to the 1920s. Unilateralism means that he's not going to be as wedded to multilateral engagements. I don't think that the Biden team, by the way, was that multilateral to begin with. They basically used multilateralism to guide the partners, the allies of the United States, into whatever direction the US wanted, and to the detriment, in my view, of the allies, especially Europe, which which has been and continues to undergo serious economic degrowth issues. In other words, very slow GDP growth, and largely because it got involved in supporting US-led war efforts in these two twin wars rather than focus on economic and social development. Trump is going to be a vehicle, a pretext for them to, yeah, especially if he alienates them, to get out of some of these entanglements. And so I do expect some developments, and I agree, like I said, I agree with analysts that the Ukraine situation may be settled faster than we expect. That will then that leads us to the next issue, which is the Middle East. That's much more difficult because Trump is as Zionist, as pro-Zionist as Biden. However, he will have more gravitas, and he will not be able, the Netanyahu government will not be able to ignore the Trump administration as much as it has ignored the Biden administration. Although the Biden administration, as we have found out from declassified documents and people coming out right out of the State Department arguing that all along there was a convergence between U.S. policy and Israeli policy. So as much as they want to use Netanyahu as a front, as the villain, he just is ignoring us. He's not going along with us. He doesn't want ceasefire. He's preventing aid. The fact is that the United States all along, at every turn was rewarding Israel with more bombs, more military aid, more money, and giving it the green light to hit targets, by the way, that the US knew those targets would simply widen the war, and they were questionable as far as violating the Geneva Convention of 1949. Now, will Trump end the war in Israel? He may end the war in Israel. The question is, what kind of peace will there be? That's where I have a lot of questions about. I don't see Trump as pro-Palestinian at all. I see Trump as an individual who is wholeheartedly committed to the Zionist state. However, he views foreign affairs, foreign policy, as a commodity, as a neoliberal, by the way, himself. He views geopolitics as a vehicle to achieve geoeconomic goals. So he's going to go over to the Arab side, especially to the Saudis, and try to get, and the Gulf states, the rich Gulf states, and try to get them on his side and try to ameliorate relations with them and get them to support, to ameliorate relations with Israel, basically starting over with the Abraham Accords that of a few years ago. I want to then now turn to what he will do with regard to China. This is the central issue. The Trump administration will be um, is on record. By the way, they are on record, 4 years of record of being anti-Chinese as anti-Chinese as any administration. Now, what has the Trump team stated during the campaign about China? That they will become even more anti-China than they were in the first administration. That they will try to do everything that they can to keep Chinese products out of the American market. We'll talk more about whether that's feasible, but they will try to make sure to use the leverage, geopolitical leverage, to keep China behind the in the technological race in artificial intelligence, superconductors, semiconductors. Sorry, and the Trump administration will use sanctions and tariffs. The Trump administration will be more pro-Taiwan than the Biden administration. There will be more agitation in the South China Sea. There will be more efforts to get Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, especially South Korea, to form a bloc, Australia, New Zealand, to form a bloc to agitate against the Chinese. Containment militarism, which started long before Biden, but Biden accelerated, will continue to accelerate under Trump. I see, in fact, the Trump administration using a more hawkish China policy toward China, more aggressively against Chinese, in order to deflect from the fact that he will ameliorate relations with Moscow. That is what he did in the first term. And so I see him doing the same thing. Now, things have moved on since 2021 when he stepped down in January. Things have changed a lot. Since then, North Korea has ameliorated relations with Russia and is involved in the war in Ukraine. That's going to be very difficult to unravel and very difficult for Trump to try to do to revisit the issue of U.S. North Korean relations improvement. I don't know how that's going to work out. It may work out for him if he ameliorates relations with Russia, then it stands to reason that he would with North Korea, because North Korea is very close now to Russia and obviously to China as well. He may try to do something there. We don't know. The larger question for me, and this is what I want to now focus on, is whether the United States is going to achieve anything with a policy of containment militarism and continuing to use geopolitics to achieve geoeconomic goals. I had written a few years ago that the United States was continuing on the course of downward slope, what I called, and many use this term, the third worldism of the United States. The United States basically in decline economically. This doesn't mean the U.S. is going to become a third world country at all, but there are signs that are troubling. When a country relies, like the United States, so heavily on the one dimension, namely the military dimension, geopolitical dimension, in order to achieve geoeconomic goals, rather than compete head on, following World Trade Organization rules, and compete head on with its rivals, as well as its allies, by the way, because Trump, people will recall, did not just go after China. He went after everybody, including allies, Europe and Australia. It doesn't matter. So I suspect we may see some of that as well. And I believe that the United States under Trump will continue to decline, and even more rapidly. And the decline has nothing to do with this individual and his cult of personality. His cult of personality isn't going to address serious structural issues deeply ingrained into the institutional mainstream. The United States has been deindustrializing since the 1980s. And as China has seen economic ascendancy on the world scale, and corporations, its multinational corporations leaving, offshoring, and going from Latin America to Asia, to East Asia, that is reflected in the United States role of trying to use geopolitics to regain some of the geoeconomic gains and threatening friendshoring and reshoring, bringing back some of those corporations, threatening sanctions, threatening cutting off the products, cutting off, for example, investments, preventing China. The Trump team has already made it clear on this one, preventing China from buying American companies, investing in certain key sectors, getting its allies to accept Chinese bids to buy up Western pro-US countries, buying up companies that the US considers would give China leverage, geopolitical leverage. So all of this spells vast contradictions within US foreign policy. Let me explain why. The US has been the leader in pursuing neoliberal policies since Reagan. Neoliberalism means free trade. It means free flow of capital globally. It means corporations can go invest anywhere they want. It means that there is not going to be maximum regulation, but minimal regulation. That's neoliberalism. That's the hallmark of neoliberalism. You don't have maximum regulation, you have minimal regulation. Neoliberalism doesn't mean that the United States is going to go to Argentina, where Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, who is a neoliberal, pro-Zionist, pro-US, pro-Trump, by the way, praised Trump when he won, and say, oh, by the way, lock them out. It should not mean that. It should not mean that, because neoliberalism theoretically encourages globalization. At the heart of neoliberalism, globalization. So here's a country that preached neoliberalism to the world, now retreating and going into black trading and using containment militarism, okay, to bully, if you will, as leverage, in other words, to using it, whether it's in Africa, where China and BRICS are offering investment in economic and social development, the US is offering military bases, and using that to get market share in Africa. which, by the way, China regards as the future in terms of providing raw materials for economic development of the BRICS group. The same with Latin America. So what we're having here are contradictions in the policy. So Trump, 1,000 Trumps would not save um, the United States from these inherent contradictions. And the amazing thing to me, as a student, a scholar of international political economy, is that these contradictions are so glaring because every sanction and tariff policy the US pursued under Trump backfired. For a very simple reason. No country in the history of the world has ever succeeded in punishing through sanctions and tariffs a rival when the rival was more powerful economically than the country imposing the sanctions and tariffs and had more leverage. The Chinese have more leverage. China-led BRICS group has greater share of world GDP, world manufacturing capacity, world trade, world shipping business. Above all, China controls most of the world's rare earth elements. Without them, high tech and defense in serious trouble. Guess what? China has used those. How is Trump going to prevent China from retaliating using rare earth elements that they have in their possession when he tries to punish China and to encircle China with its naval forces in the South China Sea and to provide more defense aid to Taiwan to send a signal to Beijing? Taiwan itself, by the way, I've mentioned this in previous videos. Taiwan itself, 40% of its trade is with Hong Kong and the mainland and China. China can asphyxiate it. But there's a deeper problem. Taiwan Semiconductor, supposedly an ally of the West and the United States, all along since the Trump period, and especially under Biden, when the West and the United States assumed they were on our side, they were dealing with China, they were supplying China, much to the shock of the United States. I suspect Korean companies are doing the same. South Korean companies are doing the same thing. Japanese companies, I've read an article by a Japanese business reporter. Japanese companies are probably doing the same thing. So China has more leverage. How Trump's foreign policy is successful against China is beyond me. I don't see it. Given that he has a 4-year record of following anti-China policies. Toward what end? Look where China is today. Look where the U.S. is today. Where the U.S. is today. So we have to look at results. Everybody's individuals, okay, in their careers and in their lives are judged by results. Companies are judged by results. Governments are judged by results. We have to look at the results. What are the results? The foreign policy of the United States may very well retreat to the Western Hemisphere. Now there, we also have problems because Latin America in the last 15 years has increasingly come under the aegis, the economic umbrella of China. From Mexico, okay, all the way down to Brazil. Now, the US may cultivate relations with Javier Milei in Argentina because he's a right wing, populist neoliberal, pro Trump, pro Zionist, pro Israel. Fine. How far is he going to get with Argentina, considering that the big dog, a BRICS country, is Brazil? And Brazil sees its interest and its future in Asia. It sees it with China and India. It doesn't always agree with them, by the way, and Ukraine doesn't agree with them on a lot of issues. But there's more agreement than there's disagreement. And there is convergence of interest, just like there is convergence of interest between Wall Street and what Israel is doing and Israeli interests, and convergence of interest on the part of Wall Street and the stock markets of Europe, although, by the way, the people are suffering, the working class, right? So what does U.S. foreign policy under Trump hold? It holds a repeat, considering the personalities, considering the people he's going to bring in his foreign policy treatment, his national defense and intelligence team. It's going to be a repeat of the first term, more or less, under new realities, because the world has moved on. By the way, the world has moved on. I want to end this session, because we're almost up on the hour, by stating that the working class in the United States abandoned the Democratic Party, punished Kamala Harris. Senator Bernie Sanders, in fact, said as much, that the working class abandoned the Democrats because the Democrats abandoned the working class. Some of them went for Trump. We know that Trump won part of it because some among the working class and middle class progressives voted for him. A lot of them stayed home. They didn't vote. And Senator Bernie Sanders is absolutely correct that when the Democratic Party of today is less progressive and it has embraced neoliberal policies, pro Wall Street, pro 1%, which owns more wealth than the bottom 90%, policies that are more right wing, by the way, domestically and in foreign affairs, than those of the 1950s under President Eisenhower. It is amazing when you examine the policies of President Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower, by the way, was a general he was the commander of the armed forces during World War II, and he becomes president in 52, gets in office in 53, two-term president, a Republican, more progressive than Biden, less militaristic, less prone, trigger happy than Biden, and more progressive in some domestic policies, considering this is the 1950s, by the way, and the early Cold War. We have to put everything into context. So this is relative, but more progressive. This is how far to the right the Democrats drifted, so far that they couldn't find it in themselves not to invite Benjamin Netanyahu, who had been already declared a war criminal, and Israel pursuing a genocide war. They invited him to speak before Congress. And then they wonder why the progressives either stayed home or voted for Jill Stein, by the way, an excellent candidate, voted for Jill Stein, or they stayed home. Why some workers went for uh, for Trump. And amazingly, identity politics analysts in the mainstream American media continue the myth, the myth that it's the voters to blame. Those dis those those voters, disillusioned voters that Trump won, and he's now institutionalized authoritarianism. Really? The Democrats had nothing to do with that? The Democrats had nothing to do with institutionalized authoritarianism, considering they were following anti labor policies and pro militarism policies the last 4 years. So the idea of finger pointing, and by the way, I think the United States would have been better off with Kamala Harris. Um, however, however, the fact is the Democrats drifted so far to the right that they left behind, exactly as the senator from Vermont said, Senator Sanders said, they left behind a block of voters who would have voted with them. Now, what would they have done in foreign affairs had they taken office? They would not have been isolationists, but they would have continued. Make no mistake about it. Kamala Harris, 1 minute before midnight, comes out and says, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to look into stopping this war." Rhetoric, nothing but pre-election rhetoric, desperation at the last minute. That should have been policy from the very beginning, not 1 minute before midnight announcing something like that. I want to thank you for tuning in. We will see where Trump goes. We know where he has been when he was in office. I suspect he will try some of the same, and I believe that he will find that things are not going to be as easy as perhaps they were in the first term. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you very much.